Tonight, imagine waking up not in your comfortable modern room, but on a straw mattress in a damp wooden house somewhere in medieval Europe, where the law was not a distant document stored in government archives, but a living, breathing force that could fine you, shame you, imprison you, or even execute you for things that today would barely raise an eyebrow. In parts of medieval England, under rulers like King Edward III, laws known as sumptuary laws strictly controlled what you were allowed to wear based on your social class, meaning if you were a simple labourer and dared to dress in fine fabrics like silk or velvet, you could face heavy fines because clothing was not just fashion, it was social hierarchy stitched into fabric, and looking too rich for your station was seen as a threat to the entire order of society. In some towns, it was illegal to eat certain luxury foods if you were not noble. Spices, game meats, and elaborate dishes were reserved for elites. So even your dinner plate was monitored by status. In medieval France, during the reign of Philip IV of France, there were strict controls on money lending and financial practices, and entire communities like Jewish merchants were heavily regulated, restricted, or expelled under royal decrees, meaning your livelihood could vanish overnight, not because you broke a moral rule, but because politics shifted. In England, the Statute of Labourers issued after the Black Death under King Edward III made it illegal for workers to demand higher wages despite labour shortages, forcing survivors of a devastating plague to accept pre-plague pay rates. And if you tried to negotiate better wages, you could be fined or jailed, essentially criminalising economic self-improvement. There were also curfew laws in many towns that required citizens to extinguish their fires at a certain hour. And the word curfew itself comes from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire, and failing to comply could result in penalties because authorities feared nighttime fires and secret gatherings. In some medieval German towns within the Holy Roman Empire, it was illegal to criticize local lords or question church teachings, and blasphemy could be punished by mutilation or death, meaning even careless speech could end your life. In certain parts of medieval Scotland, it was unlawful to refuse hospitality to a traveller of rank. And if you denied shelter to someone important passing through, you could face legal consequences because hospitality was considered a social duty enforceable by law. In medieval England, if you killed a deer in a royal forest without permission, you were not just poaching, you were committing a crime against the king's property. And forest laws were so severe that punishment could include blinding or execution. Since forests were protected for royal hunting under monarchs like William the Conqueror, who established vast royal forests and strict penalties to preserve them for nobility, there were also laws regulating brewing and baking. Alewives and bakers could be publicly punished if their products were deemed substandard, sometimes forced to stand in the stocks with their spoiled goods displayed as public humiliation. In some towns, animals could be put on trial for crimes. Documented cases exist of pigs being tried and executed for killing children, reflecting a worldview where even livestock could be legally accountable. In medieval Italy, in states like Florence, guild regulations tightly controlled who could practice certain trades, and working without guild membership could lead to confiscation of goods or expulsion, meaning your career path was legally locked unless approved by powerful associations. Marriage laws were equally restrictive. Secret marriages without proper church procedure could be declared invalid, affecting inheritance and legitimacy, and under canon law enforced by the medieval church, relationships within certain degrees of kinship were forbidden, with penalties that could include annulment or public penance. In some regions of medieval Spain during the period of the Spanish Inquisition, individuals suspected of heresy could be arrested based on accusation alone, and trials often involved torture to extract confessions, so holding unapproved beliefs or even being rumoured to hold them could destroy your life. English towns enforced the hue and cry system, where if a crime occurred, every able-bodied man was legally obligated to pursue the suspect, and failing to join the chase could result in fines, meaning you could be punished simply for not running after a thief. There were even laws about how long your hair could be, or what style you could adopt. Because personal appearance was tied to morality and order, long hair on men or extravagant dress could be condemned as sinful excess. In medieval London, building regulations dictated that houses be constructed in certain ways to reduce fire risk, and after major fires, stricter codes were imposed. So deviating from approved materials could lead to penalties. In parts of medieval Scandinavia, dueling could be legally recognized under specific conditions, meaning disputes might be settled through sanctioned combat. But stepping outside the rules of such duels could brand you an outlaw, stripping you of legal protection so that anyone could kill you without consequence. Outlawry itself was a terrifying legal status in medieval England. If declared an outlaw for failing to appear in court, you lost all legal rights and protection, effectively erased from society. In some towns, women accused of being scolds or excessively argumentative could be subjected to public punishments like the brank or scold's bridle, a humiliating metal contraption placed on the head, reflecting how law enforced gender norms. There were also laws against excessive celebration. Certain festivals were restricted or regulated because authorities feared disorder. And during times of war, speaking favourably about the enemy could be treated as treason. In agricultural communities, common land use was tightly regulated, and allowing your animals to graze illegally on another's field could result in fines or confiscation, while in some areas, fencing off land that had traditionally been common could spark legal battles and even uprisings. Under feudal obligations, peasants were often legally bound to the land, and leaving without permission from the lord could be considered a crime, limiting mobility in ways modern people would find suffocating. Even entertainment faced scrutiny. Certain games were banned because they distracted men from practicing archery, which was considered a military necessity in England. So choosing to play dice instead of training with a bow could technically put you on the wrong side of the law. In medieval universities, students and scholars sometimes had separate legal privileges under clerical status, meaning conflicts between townspeople and students could escalate into complex jurisdictional disputes, and ordinary citizens might find themselves powerless against academic immunities. In some regions, suicide was treated as a crime against God and the crown, and the deceased's property could be confiscated, punishing surviving families. There were laws governing market days, dictating when and where goods could be sold, and selling outside designated times could lead to penalties, because authorities sought to control commerce and taxation. Even death was regulated. Burial practices had to conform to church rules, and deviating from approved rites could result in denial of burial in consecrated ground. Throughout medieval Europe, Law was deeply intertwined with religion, class, and power, and survival required not just physical endurance, but constant awareness of invisible boundaries set by monarchs, lords, guilds, and the church. One careless choice of clothing, one outspoken remark, one unlicensed trade, one missed court appearance, one animal straying too far, one rumour of heresy, and your ordinary day could transform into a legal nightmare. Compared to modern legal systems with codified rights and appeals, medieval law could be immediate, personal, and brutally public, turning marketplaces into stages of punishment and forests into guarded royal sanctuaries. If you were dropped into that world with today's habits, speaking freely online style, dressing however you like, negotiating your salary, questioning authority, travelling without permission, ignoring curfew, or treating law as something abstract, you would likely accumulate fines, humiliation, or worse within weeks. The medieval world was not lawless. It was saturated with law, but those laws reflected a rigid hierarchy and a worldview that prioritized order, obedience, and divine authority over individual freedom, and surviving it required more than courage. It required constant self-censorship, social awareness, and submission to rules that today would seem not just strange, but suffocatingly impossible to live under. Tonight, imagine living in a world where law followed you into your kitchen, your bedroom, your farm, your marketplace stall, and even your thoughts, where survival depended not just on strength or intelligence, but on your ability to navigate a maze of customs, royal decrees, church mandates, and local ordinances that could change with a new ruler or a whisper of suspicion. In medieval England, under monarchs like Henry VIII, though slightly later in the medieval Tudor transition, religious allegiance itself became a legal trap, and refusing to acknowledge the monarch as head of the church could be labelled treason, punishable by execution, meaning your private belief was no longer private, but a matter of state survival. Long before that, under rulers such as King John, arbitrary justice and heavy taxation pushed the barons to force the signing of the Magna Carta, yet even that famous document did not protect. Tonight, imagine realizing that even the way you store your firewood, stack your hay, or let your animals wander could entangle you in legal consequences, because medieval law did not simply punish intentional wrongdoing, it regulated risk itself. In many rural communities across medieval England, allowing livestock to stray into a neighbour's field could result in fines imposed by manorial courts. Repeated offences might escalate into confiscation of animals. Fencing was not just practical, it was legal defence. A wandering cow could become a courtroom issue. Under kings like Edward I of England, statutes addressed land disputes, trade standards, and even the behaviour of officials. Sheriffs who failed to enforce royal commands could be punished, but so could citizens who resisted them. Refusing to comply with tax collectors risks seizure of goods. Resistance was costly. Authority was backed by immediate enforcement. In medieval France, feudal tenants sometimes owed heriot payments upon death, best livestock or valuable goods surrendered to the lord. A family already grieving could lose its strongest ox or horse. Inheritance was conditional. Even mourning carried financial consequence. Across the fragmented jurisdictions of the Holy Roman Empire, Toll collectors monitored bridges and rivers closely. Attempting to bypass official routes to avoid fees was smuggling. Goods could be confiscated instantly. Merchants navigated not only geography but layers of regulation. Crossing into a new principality meant new rules, new taxes, and new risks. In Italian republics like Florence, sumptuary laws governed clothing in meticulous detail. The number of rings worn at a wedding feast could be regulated. Violations resulted in fines meant to reinforce class boundaries. In Venice, ship captains were legally responsible for maintaining order among crews. Mutiny or desertion could lead to imprisonment, and captains who failed to enforce discipline could face legal consequences themselves. Responsibility flowed downward and upward. Religious authority carried civil power. In medieval Spain, under the oversight of the Spanish Inquisition, accusations of heresy could begin with rumor. Trials relied heavily on testimony. Conviction often meant public humiliation, imprisonment, or confiscation of wealth. Suspicion alone could dismantle a household. Forest law in England, dating back to the era of William the Conqueror, reserved vast hunting lands for royalty. Killing deer without permission could bring severe punishment. Even cutting timber or gathering firewood might violate forest boundaries. Nature itself was regulated privilege. Guilds dominated economic life. In cities such as Paris, craftsmen were required to follow precise production standards. Goods deemed inferior could be destroyed publicly. Apprentices were legally bound for fixed terms. Leaving early could result in forced return. Professional ambition required patience within structure. Market oversight was relentless. In English towns, the assize of bread fixed loaf weights according to grain prices. Selling underweight bread could result in pillory punishment. Regrating and forestalling were prosecuted to prevent artificial price inflation. Even strategic buying could be criminal. Debt laws were severe. Across medieval Europe, failure to repay loans could lead to imprisonment. Without bankruptcy protections, financial setbacks could trap individuals indefinitely. Ignoring court summons could escalate into outlawry, stripping legal protection entirely. Public morality was codified. In parts of Germany, ordinances regulated gambling, public drunkenness, and even clothing styles. Women accused of disruptive speech in England could face humiliating punishments designed to silence them. Speech and behavior were structured by rank and gender. Inheritance systems reinforced hierarchy. Under primogeniture in England, estates passed mainly to the eldest son. Younger siblings had limited legal recourse. Challenging inheritance customs often led to prolonged disputes. Military obligations were constant. The assize of arms required men to maintain weapons suited to their wealth and present them for inspection. Failure resulted in fines. Owning equipment beyond your station could arouse suspicion. Defense was stratified. Communal responsibility systems meant that if a criminal escaped, entire villages could be fined. Innocence did not guarantee protection from collective penalty. You were legally bound to your neighbor's conduct. Sanitation and fire regulations required maintaining chimneys and covering hearth fires at curfew bells. Ignoring these could bring fines because a single spark could devastate a timber. Built town. Even warmth was regulated. The medieval legal framework was not random chaos. It was systematic and deeply intrusive. It shaped your work, wages, clothing, hunting rights, marriage, inheritance, speech, travel, worship, celebration, and even grief. Authority flowed from monarch to lord to guild to bailish, narrowing personal autonomy at every layer. If you entered that world with modern instincts, freely negotiating wages, openly criticizing authority, traveling without permission, dressing for self-expression, practicing private belief, you would repeatedly cross invisible boundaries. A loaf too light, a toll unpaid, a garment too fine, a careless comment, a missed obligation. Any one of these could spiral into fines, humiliation, or worse. The strangest medieval laws were not isolated curiosities. They were strands in a dense web designed to preserve hierarchy and order above all else. Survival required constant awareness of rank and ritual. In that world, freedom existed only within carefully measured limits, and stepping beyond them, even slightly, could cost you your security, your livelihood, or your life. Tonight, imagine that even the way you light a candle before bed, the tone you use when answering a question, or the direction you walk through a marketplace could carry consequences, because medieval society did not simply recommend order. It enforced it with layers of expectation backed by punishment. In many towns across medieval England, curfew bells were rung at night to signal that hearth fires should be covered to prevent devastating blazes. Failing to comply could result in fines. A single spark in a timber-built town could destroy entire streets, and the law made sure everyone feared that responsibility. Under monarchs such as Richard II of England, especially during times of unrest following uprisings, speech critical of taxation or noble authority could be interpreted as sedition after revolts. The crown tightened surveillance. Words spoken in taverns or marketplaces could be reported. You did not need to publish a manifesto. Casual frustration could be enough to invite questioning. In medieval France, peasants were obligated to grind their grain at the lord's mill and bake bread in the lord's oven, paying fees each time. Attempting to avoid these monopolies by creating private facilities could result in penalties. Even domestic independence threatened feudal structure. Authority extended into kitchens and barns. Across the territories of the Holy Roman Empire, town charters granted privileges, but also imposed strict duties. Citizens were often required to maintain sections of city walls or contribute labor during emergencies. Refusing to assist could bring fines. Civic identity meant enforced participation. In Italian states like Florence, factional rivalries between political families could transform loyalty into liability. If your family supported the losing side, exile might follow. Exile meant confiscation of property and loss of civic status. In Venice, state industries such as shipbuilding and glassmaking were guarded intensely. Revealing technical knowledge to outsiders could result in severe punishment. Skill was power, and power was controlled. Religious conformity was deeply intertwined with civil life. In medieval Spain, under the authority of the Spanish Inquisition, deviation from accepted doctrine could be investigated through testimony alone. Trials often involved public displays of repentance. Property confiscation accompanied conviction, meaning belief carried financial stakes. forest law in England, rooted in policies established after William the Conqueror, declared vast tracts royal forests, made hunting deer without license a crime. Even gathering fallen wood or grazing animals in restricted zones could result in fines. The forest was not communal, it was privilege. Guild regulations controlled production and competition in cities such as Paris. Producing goods outside approved standards could result in destruction of merchandise. Apprentices were legally bound to masters for fixed periods and could not easily change trades. Breaking contract might mean forced return. Market oversight was strict. In English towns, forestalling and regrating were prosecuted to prevent artificial price inflation. Bread weight was regulated under the assize of bread, and selling underweight loaves could result in pillory punishment. Public humiliation reinforced compliance. Debt law was harsh. Across medieval Europe, inability to repay loans could lead to imprisonment. There were no structured bankruptcy protections. Ignoring repeated court summons risked outlawry, stripping you of legal protection entirely. Public morality laws in parts of Germany regulated gambling, drunkenness, and even wedding celebrations deemed excessive. Women accused of being disruptive speakers in England could face humiliating punishments designed to silence them. Speech was structured by rank and gender. Inheritance customs reinforced hierarchy. Under primogeniture in England, estates passed largely to the eldest son. Younger siblings had limited recourse. Challenging inheritance traditions often resulted in lengthy disputes. Tonight, imagine realizing that even the way you close your door at night is part of a legal expectation, because in the medieval world responsibility did not end at your threshold. In many towns across medieval England, householders were required to secure their homes properly, and if a thief broke in due to negligence, an unlocked gate, a poorly maintained latch, you could face scrutiny or even fines. Community safety was a shared obligation, and failure to protect your property was seen as indirectly enabling crime. Under rulers such as Henry II of England, legal reforms strengthened the jury system, but they also made ordinary men responsible for delivering verdicts. Jurors who were suspected of false judgment could themselves be punished. Justice was not a distant concept. It was something you could be penalized for administering incorrectly. The burden of law rested on common shoulders. In medieval France, the feudal system imposed banal obligations that forced peasants to use the lord's facilities, mills, ovens, wine presses, for a fee. Grinding your own grain privately could be illegal. Even attempting to bypass these monopolies risked confiscation of produce. Economic independence threatened hierarchy. Across the decentralized lands of the Holy Roman Empire, cities maintained strict watch systems. Night watchmen patrolled streets, and citizens were required to assist when alarms sounded. Refusing to join the hue and cry pursuit of a suspect could bring fines. You were legally obligated to chase criminals, whether you wanted to or not. In republics like Florence, political instability meant that supporting the wrong faction could result in exile. Exile was not temporary inconvenience. It meant loss of property, social standing, and civic rights. In Venice, strict secrecy laws protected trade and diplomacy. Speaking carelessly about state matters could draw attention from powerful councils. Silence was survival. Religious law intertwined deeply with civil consequences. In medieval Spain, under the authority of the Spanish Inquisition, deviations in ritual practice could invite investigation. Accusations were sometimes anonymous, and conviction often meant confiscation of property in addition to punishment. Faith was both spiritual and legal identity. Forest laws in England, rooted in policies from William the Conqueror, made royal forests off-limits to common hunting. Killing a deer without permission could result in severe penalties. Even gathering wood or grazing animals in restricted zones risked fines. Nature itself was under royal protection, not communal use. Guilds enforced strict production standards. In cities such as Paris, craftsmen who violated guild rules could have goods destroyed or workshops closed. Apprentices were legally bound to masters for fixed terms, and leaving early could result in pursuit. Career mobility required permission and patience. Market regulation was relentless. In English towns, selling goods outside official market days or manipulating prices through forestalling and regrating could result in fines or public punishment. Bread weight was tied to grain prices under the assize of bread, and deviation could land you in the pillory. Economic fairness was enforced through humiliation. Debt remained a constant danger. Across medieval Europe, unpaid debts could lead to imprisonment. Without bankruptcy protections, financial misfortune meant confinement. Ignoring court summons could escalate into outlawry, stripping you of legal protection and property rights. Public morality ordinances in parts of Germany regulated gambling, drinking, and even clothing deemed excessive. Women accused of being common scolds in England could face humiliating punishments designed to silence them. Speech was monitored according to status and gender. Inheritance laws reinforced hierarchy. Under primogeniture in England, estates passed largely to the eldest son. Younger siblings had limited avenues to challenge this system. Attempting to divide property differently could result in protracted disputes. Military obligations were embedded in law. The assize of arms required men to maintain appropriate weapons and present them for inspection. Failing to comply resulted in fines. Yet possessing arms beyond your rank could provoke suspicion. Defense was mandatory, but stratified by class. Communal responsibility systems meant entire villages could be fined if a criminal was not captured. Innocence did not shield you from collective penalty. You were legally tied to your neighbor's behavior. Sanitation and fire regulations demanded compliance. Curfew bells signaled covering hearth fires at night. Ignoring them could result in fines because one spark could destroy a town built of timber. Even light and warmth were regulated. The medieval legal framework was systematic, layered, and intrusive. It shaped your work, wages, clothing, hunting rights, marriage, inheritance, faith, travel, speech, celebration, and grief. Authority flowed from monarch to lord to guild to parish, narrowing personal autonomy at every step. If you entered that world carrying modern instincts, open criticism of leaders, career flexibility, private belief, self-expression in dress, spontaneous travel, you would repeatedly collide with invisible boundaries. A careless comment, a missed tithe, a garment too fine, a toll unpaid, a loaf too light. Any one of these could cascade into fines, humiliation, or worse. The strangest medieval laws were not isolated oddities. They were threads in a dense web designed to preserve order and hierarchy above all else. Survival required constant awareness of rank and ritual. In that world, freedom was conditional, carefully measured, and always subject to authority. And stepping even slightly beyond its limits could cost you your security, your livelihood, or your life. Tonite. Imagine realizing that even the way you store your grain, repair your roof, or greet a traveling stranger could draw you into legal trouble. Because medieval law did not wait for dramatic crimes. It extended into prevention, suspicion, and hierarchy. In many villages across medieval England, ale, tasters, and bread inspectors regularly examined food and drink. If your ale was watered down or your loaf underweight, you could be fined or publicly shamed. The humiliation was deliberate. Punishment was spectacle meant to warn others. Commerce was moralized. Under kings like Edward I of England, legal statutes expanded royal oversight into daily transactions. Markets operated under strict schedules, and selling goods before the official opening bell could result in confiscation. Forestalling and regretting buying goods early to resell at higher prices were prosecuted because authorities feared unrest driven by rising prices. Even strategic buying could be criminal. In medieval France, peasants owed seasonal labor known as corvée to maintain roads, bridges, and fortifications. Refusing to appear could bring penalties. Infrastructure was built on obligation, not wages. Feudal dues could also include payments upon inheritance, and heirs who failed to pay relief fees might temporarily lose access to land. Death triggered legal costs. Across the fragmented territories of the Holy Roman Empire, each city maintained unique ordinances. Entering a trade without recognized citizenship rights could lead to expulsion. Migrants needed sponsors, fees, and years of residency before gaining full privileges. Urban freedom was conditional. Crossing into another principality meant new taxes, new tolls, and new risks. In Italian city, states such as Florence, clothing inspectors enforced sumptuary laws limiting jewelry, silk, and embroidery. Dressing above your station suggested ambition, and ambition threatened order. In Venice, glassmakers on the island of Murano were sometimes forbidden from emigrating to protect trade secrets. Skilled workers were watched carefully. Knowledge was treated as state property. Religious conformity remained tightly bound to law. In medieval Spain under the Spanish Inquisition, denunciations could be anonymous. Deviations in prayer practice, dietary customs, or reading material could prompt investigation. Convictions often resulted in public penance or confiscation of goods. Faith was not private, it was regulated. Forest law in England, rooted in policies from William the Conqueror, protected royal hunting grounds fiercely. Hunting deer without permission could result in severe punishment. Even gathering wood or grazing animals in restricted areas risked fines. Nature was legally stratified. Guild systems controlled professional life. In cities like Paris, masters were limited in how many apprentices they could train. Producing goods outside, approved techniques could lead to destruction of merchandise. Apprentices were legally bound for years, and leaving early could result in forced return. Career changes were not casual decisions. Debt law was unforgiving. Across medieval Europe, failure to repay loans could lead to imprisonment. There were no structured bankruptcy protections. Ignoring court summons could escalate into outlawry, stripping you of legal protection and property rights. Once declared outside the law, you were vulnerable. Public morality ordinances in parts of Germany regulated gambling, drunkenness, and even wedding celebrations. Excessive feasting could draw fines. Women accused of being disruptive speakers in England could face humiliating punishments. Speech and behaviour were codified differently by gender and rank. Inheritance customs reinforced hierarchy. Under primogeniture in England, estates passed primarily to the eldest son. Younger siblings had limited legal avenues to challenge this system. Attempting to divide property differently often led to prolonged disputes. Military readiness was mandatory. The assize of arms required men to maintain weapons appropriate to their wealth. Tonight, imagine discovering that even your posture in a procession, the order in which you walk during a festival, or the fabric lining inside your cloak could draw the attention of officials, because medieval society did not simply encourage hierarchy, it legally reinforced it in visible, measurable ways. In many towns across medieval England, civic processions placed guilds, clergy, and nobles in strictly defined positions. If a craftsman attempted to stand ahead of a higher-ranking guild, disputes could erupt and fines could follow. Public space was ranked space. Under monarchs like Henry II of England, the expansion of royal courts meant that more disputes, land conflicts, inheritance claims, accusations of theft were drawn under centralized authority. But access to justice came with risk. If you brought a false claim or failed to provide sufficient proof, you could be fined for wasting the court's time. Litigation itself was dangerous if you misjudged your case. In medieval France, peasants owed feudal aids, financial contributions, demanded by lords on specific occasions, such as knighting a son or marrying a daughter. Refusing or delaying payment could lead to penalties. Even your lord's family milestones could cost you money. Authority reached into events you did not choose. Across the decentralized territories of the Holy Roman Empire, cities imposed strict citizenship requirements. Without recognized status as a burgher, you might be barred from owning property within city walls. Renting space unofficially or trading without civic approval could result in expulsion. Urban life was regulated privilege. In Italian city, states like Florence, sumptuary officials actively inspected clothing at weddings and festivals. Gold embroidery, pearl decorations, and certain silks were restricted to elite families. Violations resulted in fines. Fashion was political. In Venice, citizens involved in state industries such as glassmaking were sometimes restricted from leaving the Republic to prevent knowledge transfer. Leaving without permission could lead to punishment. Skill was state property. Religious conformity remained intertwined with legal identity. In medieval Spain, under the authority of the Spanish Inquisition, testimony from neighbours could initiate investigations. Owning banned texts, observing rituals quietly at home, or deviating in subtle ways could invite scrutiny. Convictions often resulted in public penance or confiscation of goods. Faith was surveilled. In England, forest laws, strengthened after William the Conqueror, designated vast tracts as royal forests, made hunting without license illegal. Even collecting fallen branches or grazing animals in certain areas could bring fines. Nature itself was stratified by rank. Survival skills were not always lawful. Guild systems across Europe restricted economic freedom. In cities such as Paris, producing goods outside approved techniques could lead to confiscation. Masters could be penalized for employing too many apprentices. Apprentices who fled contracts could be pursued and forced back. Professional mobility was tightly fenced. Market regulation was relentless. In English towns, forestalling, buying goods before they reached official markets was illegal. Regrating, reselling at higher prices was prosecuted. Authorities believed price manipulation threatened social stability. Bread weight was carefully regulated under the assize of bread, and selling loaves even slightly under standard could lead to public humiliation in the pillory. Debt law remained unforgiving. Across much of medieval Europe, inability to repay loans could lead to imprisonment. There were no safety nets or bankruptcy systems. Meanwhile, ignoring repeated court summons could escalate into outlawry. Once declared outside the law, you lost legal protection entirely. Public morality was codified. In parts of Germany, ordinances punished excessive drinking, gambling, or dancing during restricted periods. Women accused of public scolding in England could face humiliating punishments. Speech was regulated differently based on gender and status. Inheritance systems reinforced hierarchy. Under primogeniture in England, estates passed to the eldest son, limiting division. Younger siblings had little legal recourse. Attempts to challenge inheritance customs could result in lengthy legal battles. Military readiness was embedded in daily life. The assize of arms required inspections of weapons. Failing to maintain appropriate arms brought fines. Owning equipment above your rank could provoke suspicion. Defense was an obligation calibrated by class. Communal responsibility systems meant that entire villages could be fined if a criminal was not captured. Innocence did not protect you from collective penalty. Living in a community meant sharing legal risk. Sanitation laws required households to maintain chimneys, manage waste, and obey curfew bells signaling the covering of fires. Ignoring these could result in fines. Fire prevention was a legal duty in crowded towns built largely of wood. The medieval legal world was layered and pervasive. It shaped what you wore, where you stood, how you earned, what you hunted, how you worshipped, how you married, how you inherited, how you celebrated, and even how you grieved. Authority flowed from monarch to noble, to guild to parish, each layer narrowing personal choice. If you stepped into that world with modern instincts, freely changing careers, criticizing leaders openly, traveling without documentation, negotiating wages, dressing for self-expression, you would repeatedly cross invisible boundaries. A misplaced word, a garment too rich, a toll unpaid, a loaf too light, a wage demand too bold. Any of these could spiral into fines, humiliation, or worse. The strangest medieval laws were not isolated curiosities, but part of a dense structure designed to preserve order above all else. Survival required constant awareness of rank, ritual, and regulation. In that world, freedom was conditional and carefully measured, and stepping even slightly beyond its narrow limits could cost you your security, your livelihood, or your life. Tonight, imagine that even your household chores unfold under invisible rules, that sweeping your doorway at the wrong hour or allowing wastewater to trickle too far into the street could bring officials to your door, because medieval law was not distant or abstract. It was immediate, local, and woven into daily survival. In many towns across medieval England, residents were required to keep the space directly outside their homes clean. Failing to remove waste or debris could result in fines imposed by local ward officials. Public hygiene, though primitive by modern standards, was enforced with surprising seriousness because disease and fire were constant threats. Under rulers like Edward I of England, legal authority expanded through statutes that touched trade, property, and civic duty. If you refused to serve on a jury when summoned, you could face financial penalties. Civic participation was compulsory, and misjudging a case or failing to appear could bring consequences. Justice was not optional. It was an obligation imposed from above. In medieval France, peasants owed annual rents, not just in coin, but sometimes in produce or livestock. Missing these payments could lead to seizure of goods or land use restrictions. Inheritance often triggered additional payments known as reliefs, forcing heirs to negotiate access to property they believed was theirs. Death did not end obligation, it transferred it. Across the territories of the Holy Roman Empire, overlapping jurisdictions meant that a dispute between two individuals could involve church courts, city courts, and princely courts simultaneously. Choosing the wrong venue for a complaint could invalidate your claim. Law was a maze, and navigating it required knowledge few common people possessed. In city-states, such as Florence, sumptuary officers monitored clothing not just for extravagance, but for compliance with moral expectations. A merchant's wife wearing pearls beyond her permitted number could face fines. In Venice, restrictions were placed on citizens travelling abroad if they possessed sensitive technical knowledge, especially in industries like glassmaking. Leaving without permission could bring punishment. Skill was guarded like treasure. Religious conformity remained inseparable from legal life. In medieval Spain, under the Spanish Inquisition, neighbours could denounce one another anonymously. Trials did not always require physical proof, and confessions were sometimes extracted under pressure. Conviction often meant public humiliation, imprisonment, or confiscation of wealth. Suspicion alone could unravel a family's security. In England, forest law, originating under William the Conqueror, made large tracts of land exclusive royal hunting grounds. Killing deer or clearing forest without license could result in harsh penalties. Even gathering fallen wood might violate regulations. The natural world was divided by rank, and survival activities could become crimes. Guilds controlled not just trade but behavior. In cities like Paris, masters could be penalized for producing goods outside regulated standards. Apprentices were bound by contract and could not marry or change professions freely. Breaking apprenticeship terms could result in pursuit and forced return. Professional life was structured, not flexible. Market laws were strict and relentless. In English towns, forestalling, purchasing goods before official market hours, was illegal regrating, reselling goods at inflated prices, was punishable. Authorities believed price stability prevented unrest. Bread weight was fixed under the assize of bread, and deviation could lead to pillory punishment in the town square. Debt laws offered little mercy. Failure to repay could result in imprisonment. Tonight, imagine discovering that even the way you build a fence, greet a stranger, or store your grain could carry legal consequences, because in the medieval world authority extended into details so small they would barely register in modern life. In many villages across medieval England, boundary disputes were taken extremely seriously. Moving a hedge or fence even slightly could result in legal action before the manorial court. Land was survival, and survival was regulated. A few misplaced feet of soil could mean fines, forced restoration, or public reprimand. Under rulers like Henry III of England, royal writs expanded centralized legal control. Ignoring a writ, essentially a formal legal command, could escalate consequences quickly. Sheriffs had authority to seize goods if orders were disobeyed. Refusing compliance was not civil disobedience. It was rebellion against the crown. In medieval France, feudal dues extended beyond labor into payments upon inheritance. When a tenant died, heirs sometimes paid relief fees to assume control of the land. If payment was delayed or disputed, land access could be denied. Grief was interrupted by legal obligation. Widows often relied on dower rights for survival. And if documentation was unclear, disputes could leave them destitute. Across the territories of the Holy Roman Empire, toll roads and river checkpoints fractured commerce into a chain of permissions. Attempting to bypass official crossings to avoid paying could result in confiscation of goods. Trade was monitored intensely because rulers relied on transit revenue. Even your route was political. In Italian republics such as Florence, sumptuary laws were enforced with surprising regularity. Women were fined for wearing excessive jewelry, men for sleeves too elaborate. Authorities believed visible extravagance blurred social distinctions and threatened order. In Venice, strict laws regulated shipbuilding secrets. Unauthorized sharing of maritime technology could result in imprisonment. Knowledge itself was guarded property. Religious law intersected with daily conduct. In medieval Spain, under the oversight of the Spanish Inquisition, attending unauthorized religious gatherings could provoke suspicion. Books deemed heretical were confiscated. Accusations often relied on testimony rather than evidence. Conviction could mean imprisonment, public penance, or property seizure. Belief was not merely internal, it was inspected. In England, the assize of arms required men to possess weapons appropriate to their wealth and present them for inspection. Failing to maintain required equipment brought fines. Yet owning armor or weapons above your station could provoke suspicion. Defense was an obligation carefully matched to rank. Guild systems across Europe tightly regulated professional life. In cities like Paris, a craftsman could not open a workshop without guild approval. Producing goods outside official methods could result in confiscation or destruction. Apprentices were legally bound for years. Fleeing early could lead to forced return. Career shifts were not casual decisions. They were controlled transitions. Forest law in England, rooted in policies dating back to William the Conqueror, made hunting deer or even gathering timber without license a punishable offence. Some punishments in earlier centuries included mutilation. Even when penalties softened over time, fines remained harsh. Nature was stratified by privilege. Public behavior carried constant risk. Defamation laws punished insults against nobles more severely than insults between equals. In some towns of Germany, public drunkenness during religious festivals could bring fines. Disorder was treated as a threat to communal stability. Women accused of being common scolds in England could face humiliating punishment devices intended to silence them. Speech was not free. It was policed. Debt imprisonment remained a looming threat. Without modern bankruptcy protections, inability to repay could lead to confinement until settlement. Meanwhile, failing to respond to repeated court summons risked outlawry, stripping you of legal protection entirely. Once outlawed, you existed outside the law's shield. Marriage and inheritance were equally regulated. Serfs often required permission to marry and paid fees known as merchant. Marrying without approval could bring penalties. Under primogeniture in England, estates passed primarily to the eldest son, limiting division of property. Younger siblings had fewer options and little legal recourse to challenge the system. Even food preservation and market activity were monitored. Selling goods outside official market days could result in confiscation. Regrating, buying goods to resell at higher prices, was illegal. Authorities feared manipulation of supply. Bread weight, beer quality, and meat freshness were inspected regularly. Communal responsibility meant entire villages could be fined if a criminal escaped innocence did not exempt you from collective penalty. Living in community meant sharing legal risk. Sanitation laws required households to maintain chimneys and manage waste properly to prevent fires and disease. Ignoring curfew bells that signaled extinguishing open flames could result in fines. Fire safety was a legal matter. The medieval legal system was not random chaos. It was structured, layered, and relentless. It shaped how you worked, dressed, hunted, married, inherited, spoke, traded, worshipped, celebrated, and even mourned. Authority flowed downward from monarch to lord to guild to parish, each layer adding expectation. If you entered that world with modern instincts, freely negotiating wages, speaking openly against leaders, travelling without permission, dressing for self-expression, practicing private belief, you would encounter invisible boundaries everywhere. A minor misstep, a garment too ornate, a toll unpaid, a loaf too light, a public complaint too bold, cooled cascade into fines, humiliation, or worse. The strangest medieval laws were not isolated oddities about clothing or bread. They formed a dense web that wrapped around daily life so tightly that individuality struggled to breathe. In that world, freedom was conditional, carefully measured, and always subject to authority, and stepping beyond its narrow lines could cost you everything. Tonite. Imagine realizing that even the way you look at someone of higher rank could be interpreted as disrespect, because in the medieval world hierarchy was not subtle. It was enforced through visible, daily reminders backed by law. In many regions of medieval England, showing open contempt toward a noble or refusing to remove your hat in appropriate settings could escalate into accusations of disorder or dishonor. Status demanded visible obedience. The law did not always need written statutes. Custom carried legal weight. Under rulers such as Edward III of England, economic regulation intensified. after the Black Death. The Statute of Labourers attempted to freeze wages and restrict worker mobility. If you left your village seeking better pay without official permission, you could be pursued and returned. Ambition was treated as instability. Workers who refused assigned wages risked fines or imprisonment. Opportunity was rationed. In medieval France, feudal obligations required peasants to maintain roads, repair castles, and provide agricultural labour on designated days. Ignoring these duties could result in penalties imposed by local courts. Justice was immediate and local, often decided by those with power over you. Appeals were rare and costly. Across the territories of the Holy Roman Empire, laws differed dramatically from one principality to another. A merchant trading cloth legally in one city might face confiscation in another if he lacked proper local authorization. Border crossings were not just geographic, they were legal transitions into entirely new systems. In Italian city, states like Florence, factional rivalries between political groups meant that shifting alliances could suddenly render a family suspect. Banishment was a common punishment. Overnight, you could lose your home, your business, and your civic rights. In Venice, strict controls were placed on glass-making techniques in Murano. Craftsmen were forbidden from sharing trade secrets under threat of punishment. Innovation belonged to the state. Religious law shaped everyday conduct. In medieval Spain under the Spanish Inquisition, deviations in worship practices could be investigated. Failing to observe required feast days or fasting rules in some regions could result in fines. Heresy trials did not always rely on physical evidence. Testimony and suspicion could suffice. Faith was inseparable from legal identity. In England, forest laws rooted in policies dating back to William the Conqueror made royal hunting grounds off limits to commoners. Killing a deer without permission could result in harsh punishment. Even gathering fallen wood might violate regulations. The forest was protected not for ecology, but for privilege. Guilds controlled professional life tightly. In cities like Paris, craftsmen had to adhere to precise production standards. Selling goods that failed inspection could result in confiscation or destruction. Apprentices were legally bound to masters for years, and breaking contract could mean pursuit and forced return. Careers were controlled pathways. Debt laws were unforgiving across much of medieval Europe. Failure to repay loans could result in imprisonment. There were no structured bankruptcy protections. Meanwhile, failing to appear in court when summoned could escalate into outlawry. Once outlawed, you lost legal protection. Anyone could harm you without consequence. Public morality was enforced through humiliation. In parts of Germany, ordinances regulated gambling, drunkenness, and even clothing deemed immodest. Tonight, imagine discovering that even your laughter carries risk, that a joke told at the wrong moment in the wrong company could spiral into accusation. Because in the medieval world, humour, like clothing, like work, like faith, existed within boundaries set by authority. In many towns across medieval England, public order laws punished unlawful assemblies, meaning that gathering in large numbers without clear purpose could attract suspicion. A festive crowd could quickly be interpreted as a riot. If authorities believed unrest was brewing, arrests followed swiftly. Celebration and rebellion sometimes looked the same to those in power. Under rulers like Richard II of England, especially in the tense years following uprisings such as the Peasants' Revolt, speaking critically about taxation or feudal obligations could be labelled sedition. Words were political weapons. After periods of unrest, governments tightened surveillance, and casual complaints about lords or taxes could bring unwanted attention. In an age without social media, a whispered grievance in a tavern was still powerful enough to endanger you. Across medieval France, peasants were required to use specific presses and ovens owned by their lords under systems of banalique phase. Attempting to press your own grapes or bake bread in a private oven to avoid fees could lead to penalties. Even domestic independence threatened economic hierarchy. Authority inserted itself into the kitchen and the vineyard. In the sprawling territories of the Holy Roman Empire, coin clipping, shaving tiny amounts of silver from coins, was treated as a grave offence. Even being suspected of tampering with currency could result in brutal punishment. Economic trust was sacred. Trade depended on stable coinage, and violating that trust was seen as attacking the entire social order. In city-states like Florence, political participation was tightly regulated by guild membership. If you were not enrolled in a recognized guild, your voice in civic affairs was virtually non-existent. Attempting to influence politics without proper standing could result in exclusion or exile. Power was structured like a ladder, and climbing without permission was dangerous. In Venice, laws restricted citizens from marrying foreigners without approval in certain periods. Fearing dilution of civic identity, even love could be political. Religious conformity remained a constant pressure. In late medieval Spain, under the watchful authority of the Spanish Inquisition, heresy trials did not always require strong physical evidence. Reputation and testimony weighed heavily. If neighbors claimed you practiced forbidden rituals, proving innocence could be nearly impossible. Confiscation of goods often accompanied conviction, meaning faith disputes became economic ruin. In England, labourers were required to accept wages set by law after the Black Death under policies, strengthened during the reign of Edward III of England. Leaving employment early or demanding higher pay could result in imprisonment. Economic aspiration beyond assigned limits was treated as destabilizing. Work was obligation, not negotiation. Hunting remained restricted by rank. Forest laws that originated under Norman rule forbade peasants from hunting deer or boar in designated royal forests. Even carrying a bow near forest boundaries could arouse suspicion. Your survival skills could incriminate you. Owning certain breeds of hunting dogs required noble status. Nature was stratified. In medieval Germany, town councils enforced curfews and regulated night movement. Walking streets after designated hours without lantern or justification could lead to questioning or fines. Darkness belonged to authority. In some towns, prostitutes were required to wear identifying clothing to distinguish them from other women. Identity itself was mandated through dress. Inheritance laws restricted personal choice. Under primogeniture in England, dividing estates among multiple children was discouraged. Challenging inheritance customs could lead to legal disputes lasting years. Younger siblings often had limited options outside church or military service. Your future was assigned by birth order debt imprisonment. Haunted many. Failing to repay a loan could confine you indefinitely. Without structured bankruptcy systems, misfortune translated into incarceration. Meanwhile, failure to respond to repeated court summons risked outlawry, a condition where you lost legal protection entirely. Anyone could harm you without fear of punishment. Public morality laws extended into daily conduct. In certain Swiss cantons and German towns, excessive drinking during religious festivals could result in fines. Dancing during fasting periods could be restricted. Even joy was regulated by the liturgical calendar. In English towns, selling goods outside official market hours could result in confiscation. Time itself was structured by law. Communal responsibility systems meant entire villages could be fined if criminals escaped justice. You were legally tied to your neighbour's behaviour. If a thief fled and could not be produced, collective penalties followed. Innocence was irrelevant in the face of communal obligation. Marriage for serfs often required permission from their lord, sometimes accompanied by fees. Marrying without consent could lead to fines or punishment. Even personal relationships were economically entangled with feudal authority. Dowries were recorded and enforceable. Disputes over unpaid portions could escalate into court cases. The medieval legal framework did not merely punish wrongdoing. It defined identity. It told you what you could wear, where you could walk, whom you could marry, how much you could earn, what you could hunt, when you could celebrate, and how loudly you could speak. Authority flowed downward from crown to lord to guild to parish, each level reinforcing boundaries that left little space for individual autonomy. If you entered that world with modern instincts, freely expressing opinions, changing careers, travelling spontaneously, negotiating wages, dressing for self-expression, practicing private belief, you would find yourself colliding with invisible walls. A single careless comment, a garment too fine, a wage demand too bold, a hunt too ambitious, a gathering too loud. Any of these could trigger fines, humiliation, or worse. The strangest medieval laws were not merely isolated quirks about bread weight or fabric colour. They were part of a dense network designed to preserve order and hierarchy at all costs. In that world, survival meant constant awareness of rank, ritual, and regulation. Freedom existed only inside narrow boundaries, and stepping even slightly beyond them could unravel your security in a single irreversible moment. Tonight, imagine realizing that even your shadow on a wall might seem like evidence of disobedience, because in the medieval world law did not wait for dramatic crimes. It governed the ordinary, the repetitive, the deeply personal. In many English villages throughout the later Middle Ages, every household was enrolled in a tithing group under the Frank Pledge system. If one member committed a crime and fled, the rest could be fined for failing to produce him. You were legally responsible for your neighbours, whether you trusted them or not. Community was not just social, it was enforceable. Under monarchs like Edward I of England, statutes expanded royal oversight into trade and taxation. Customs duties were levied on wool exports, and merchants attempting to bypass official ports risked confiscation of goods. Smuggling was treated as theft from the crown. Economic independence was suspicious. Even minor miscalculations in declared cargo weight could bring penalties. In medieval France, Peasants were bound to provide not just labour but also military support when required. Failing to respond to a call for service could result in fines or property seizure. Your body was part of the defence system. Meanwhile, salt laws under the gabelle forced households to purchase fixed quantities of taxed salt annually. Avoiding that purchase could mark you as a smuggler. The flavouring in your soup carried legal implications. Across the decentralised territories of the Holy Roman Empire, cities guarded their privileges fiercely. Entering certain trades without citizenship rights could lead to expulsion. To become a full citizen, you often needed sponsorship, fees, and years of residence. Urban freedom was conditional and monitored. Crossing from one principality to another meant adjusting instantly to a new web of statutes. In Italian city-states, such as Florence, exile was frequently used as punishment for political dissent. A change in factional control could mean your name was added to a list overnight. Property could be confiscated, homes sealed, and families forced out. Politics was survival. In Venice, maritime trade secrets were guarded with such intensity that unauthorized disclosure could lead to imprisonment. Economic dominance depended on silence. Religious observance remained legally intertwined with daily life. In medieval Spain under the Spanish Inquisition, even small deviations, such as washing practices or dietary habits, could be interpreted as evidence of secret belief. Trials relied heavily on testimony, and conviction often resulted in public punishment and property seizure. Faith was policed through fear. In England, the assize of bread required bakers to maintain specific loaf weights based on grain prices. Selling bread even slightly underweight could result in pillory punishment. The humiliation was intentional, a warning to others. In parts of Germany, guild inspectors could destroy substandard goods. On the spot, craftsmanship was enforced through regulation, not consumer choice. Forest laws remained notoriously strict. Policies rooted in the reign of William the Conqueror made royal forests. Tonight, imagine that even silence could be suspicious, that failing to swear loyalty loudly enough, or hesitating when asked about your allegiances, might plant a seed of doubt that grows into accusation. Because in the medieval world, law and loyalty were braided together so tightly that separating personal belief from public duty was nearly impossible. In many parts of medieval England, oaths were sacred legal instruments. Breaking an oath was not just dishonourable, it could lead to fines, imprisonment, or loss of property. Swearing falsely on relics or the Bible carried both spiritual and civil consequences. Your word was legally binding in a way modern casual promises are not. Under kings like Henry II of England, royal justice expanded through travelling judges, but that also meant royal oversight penetrated deeper into village life. If you were summoned for jury duty in a local assize and failed to appear, you could be fined. Participation in justice was mandatory. In some cases, jurors who delivered verdicts displeasing to authorities could themselves face punishment, blurring the line between civic duty and personal risk. In medieval France, salt taxes known as the gabelle were so strictly enforced that smuggling salt became a widespread crime. Possessing untaxed salt could result in heavy penalties. Something as ordinary as seasoning food could entangle you in legal trouble. Economic control was maintained through everyday commodities. Across the shifting territories of the Holy Roman Empire, coinage laws required transactions to be conducted in approved currency. Refusing debased coin or attempting to trade with unofficial mintings could bring accusations of fraud. Counterfeiting was punished harshly, often by mutilation or death. Money itself was sacred to authority. In cities like Florence, political exile was a common punishment. Aligning with the losing faction in civic disputes could result in banishment not just for you, but for your entire family. Exile meant confiscation of property and erasure from public life. Politics was survival. In Venice, strict maritime laws regulated who could trade certain luxury goods. Unauthorized dealings in restricted commodities could lead to imprisonment because commerce was a pillar of state power. Marriage contracts were intensely scrutinized. In parts of Germany, dowries were legally recorded, and disputes over unpaid dowry portions could escalate into court battles lasting years. Breaking a marriage agreement might result in financial penalties. Family alliances were economic structures backed by law. Forest law in England continued to loom large. Carrying hunting tools near a royal forest boundary could be enough to arouse suspicion. In earlier centuries, punishments included blinding or mutilation, and even when penalties softened over time, fines remained steep. The forest was a legal minefield. Even your dog's breed could determine whether you were questioned, because certain hunting dogs were restricted to nobility. Religious conformity was embedded into civil identity. In medieval Spain, under institutions like the Spanish Inquisition, denunciations could be made secretly, and the accused often did not know their accuser. Property seizure frequently accompanied conviction. Suspicion alone could destroy generational wealth. Across much of Europe, refusal to observe church feast days or fasting periods could attract fines imposed by local authorities. Guild control extended beyond production into personal conduct. In cities such as Paris, guild members were required to attend meetings and religious observances associated with their trade. Skipping mandatory gatherings could bring penalties. Brotherhood was legally enforced. Apprentices were prohibited from marrying without consent, and violation could void contracts. Market inspectors monitored not just goods, but behavior. In medieval English towns, regrators who bought goods to resell at inflated prices were prosecuted. Authorities believed price stability was essential to order. Attempting to profit from scarcity could result in fines or imprisonment. Early anti-profiteering laws were strict. In some regions of Scandinavia, blood feuds were regulated by law. Compensation payments, known as ordeal, were calculated based on status. Failure to pay could reignite violence. Justice balanced precariously between formal courts and customary retaliation. In certain Swiss cantons, communal councils imposed fines for public drunkenness or disorder during religious festivals. Celebration had limits. Military readiness was constant. In England, the assize of arms required inspections of weapons. Failing to maintain required equipment could result in penalties. Yet owning armor beyond your rank might provoke suspicion. Defense was both obligation and boundary. Inheritance systems shaped destiny rigidly. Under primogeniture, younger sons often entered monasteries or sought military service, because land division was discouraged. Challenging inheritance patterns could lead to legal disputes and royal arbitration. Your birth order was nearly law. Debt laws were unforgiving. In various European regions, debtors could be imprisoned until repayment. Without modern bankruptcy protections, financial miscalculation could mean indefinite confinement. Meanwhile, if you failed to answer repeated court summons in England, outlawry loomed as ultimate punishment. Legal invisibility was worse than imprisonment. Even clothing signalled legal risk. Sumptuary laws in Italian city, states regulated fur types, sleeve widths, jewellery amounts, and even embroidery patterns. Violating these codes suggested arrogance or social climbing. Authority feared blurred boundaries between classes. In some English communities, if a body was discovered and no culprit identified, the entire village might be fined under inherited Norman systems. Collective responsibility meant your neighbour's crime could cost you personally. You were tied legally to your community's behaviour. Public works were mandatory. Repairing roads, bridges and walls often required unpaid labour from residents. Refusal could bring fines. Civic maintenance was enforced contribution. In plague years, quarantine laws were imposed, and breaking isolation could result in severe punishment. Fear of contagion justified strict enforcement. The medieval legal framework did not simply exist in courthouses. It pulsed through farms, markets, churches, forests, homes, and harbours. It determined how loudly you spoke, how brightly you dressed, how far you travelled, how much you earned, how you prayed, how you inherited, how you hunted, and how you celebrated. Authority was layered: crown, lord, guild, church, and each layer added new obligations. If you stepped into that world with modern instincts, questioning leaders openly, changing careers freely, travelling without explanation, negotiating wages assertively, expressing beliefs publicly, you would quickly accumulate suspicion and penalties. Survival required instinctive awareness of boundaries drawn long before your birth. The strangest medieval laws were not isolated oddities. They formed a dense web where nearly every personal choice intersected with power. In that world, freedom was not assumed. It was negotiated within strict limits, and stepping beyond those limits, even by accident, could unravel your security in a single day. Tonight, imagine realizing that even the air you breathe feels owned by someone more powerful than you, because in the medieval world authority was not a distant institution. It was personal, local, and constantly present. In many villages across medieval England, you were required to attend the manorial court several times a year, not because you had committed a crime, but because attendance itself was an obligation. Missing court without valid excuse could lead to fines. Justice was participatory, but participation was compulsory. Under kings like Edward I of England, systems of taxation and record keeping expanded, and sheriffs enforced royal authority with vigour. If you failed to pay tallage or other levies assessed on your town, property could be seized. Taxes were not debated, they were demanded. In some cases, entire communities were punished if quotas were not met. Collective financial responsibility meant your neighbour's poverty could become your burden. In medieval France, the Gabelle salt tax turned something as simple as preserving food into a legal hazard. Smuggling salt to avoid inflated prices was common, but being caught could mean imprisonment or forced labour. The seasoning on your table could be evidence in court. Economic survival sometimes required breaking the law, and breaking the law risked everything. Across the shifting jurisdictions of the Holy Roman Empire, each bishopric or principality maintained its own tolls, tariffs, and criminal codes. A merchant who unknowingly violated a local ordinance, perhaps by trading goods without a regional permit, could see cargo confiscated immediately. Law changed with geography, and ignorance was no excuse. In Italian city, states such as Florence, strict sumptuary laws dictated not only fabric and jewelry, but how many buttons could decorate a garment. Authorities believed that visible luxury destabilized social order. Dressing above your station could result in fines. In Venice, political secrecy was so valued that revealing state matters, even casually, could bring interrogation by powerful councils. Words spoken in taverns were not always forgotten. Religious conformity remained deeply tied to law. In late medieval Spain, under the authority of the Spanish Inquisition, suspicion alone could trigger investigation. Neighbors could denounce one another anonymously. Confiscation of property often accompanied conviction, making heresy accusations financially devastating. Faith was monitored with legal force. Tonight, imagine that even your smallest habit, how you greet someone, how you light a candle, how you cut your hair, could place you on the wrong side of authority, because in medieval Europe law did not merely respond to crime, it attempted to choreograph society itself. In many English towns during the later Middle Ages, municipal ordinances dictated when shop shutters had to open and close, and failing to trade during prescribed hours could result in fines. Not because you harmed anyone, but because regulated commerce maintained tax flow and social order. If you tried to operate outside official market days, your goods could be seized on the spot. Profit without permission was suspicious. Under monarchs like Edward I of England, legal reforms expanded royal courts, but they also extended royal authority deep into local life. Royal justices travelled on circuit, and ignoring a summons was dangerous. Repeated absence could escalate into outlawry, a legal condition so severe that it effectively erased your rights. Once outlawed, your property could be confiscated, contracts voided, and you could be attacked without legal consequence. The law did not just punish behaviour, it could remove your existence from protection. In medieval Wales and Ireland, complex compensation systems required payment for injuries based on rank. The higher someone's status, the greater the compensation owed. Accidentally injuring a noble could bankrupt a peasant family for generations. Social hierarchy determined the value of harm. In parts of what is now Germany, imperial free cities enforced detailed building codes. Timber frames had to meet specified alignments, and projecting upper stories could not extend beyond regulated limits. Violating these restrictions could result in forced demolition. Imagine constructing part of your home only to watch officials tear it down because it intruded a few inches too far. Across medieval Christendom, church courts exercised enormous authority over marriage disputes. Marrying within prohibited degrees of kinship, even unknowingly, could lead to annulment. That meant children could suddenly be declared illegitimate, affecting inheritance and status. Your entire lineage could be legally destabilized by a genealogical technicality. In England, clandestine marriages performed without banns or witnesses might later be contested, turning personal relationships into courtroom battles. In mercantile hubs like Venice and Genoa, maritime laws required sailors to follow rigid contractual obligations. Throwing cargo overboard without consensus, even during storms, could result in legal disputes over liability. Survival decisions at sea were judged in court upon return. In the Hanseatic trading network centered around cities like Lefebvre, merchant privileges were protected fiercely, and unauthorized competition could be prosecuted. Trade was guarded by legal walls as much as physical ones. Medieval English forest law remained notoriously harsh long after its Norman origins. Hunting even small game within designated royal forests without license could result in mutilation in earlier centuries and heavy fines later. Owning bows or greyhounds in certain regions required proof of rank. Your hobbies were policed. In agricultural communities, assarting, clearing forest land for cultivation without permission, was illegal. Expanding your farm to feed your family could be interpreted as encroachment on royal rights. There were also strict apprenticeship contracts. In cities like Paris, apprentices were legally bound to masters for years. Running away before your term ended could result in pursuit and forced return. Masters, too, were bound by regulations dictating how they trained apprentices. Breaking the contract invited guild penalties. Career mobility was tightly fenced. In medieval Spain, during periods of tension under institutions like the Spanish Inquisition, possession of certain books could raise suspicion. Texts deemed heretical or improperly translated might be confiscated and their owners interrogated. Literacy was not always liberating. It could be incriminating. Similarly, in some parts of Italy, public displays of factional loyalty, wearing certain colours tied to rival political families, could provoke legal retaliation or exile if your side lost power. Sumptuary laws grew so detailed in regions like Florence that they regulated the number of rings a woman could wear, the fabric lining of cloaks, and even the expense of funeral ceremonies. Mourning rituals themselves were subject to spending caps. Grief had a budget. In parts of England, labour laws passed after the Black Death prohibited workers from relocating to seek higher wages. If you attempted to capitalise on labour shortages by demanding more pay, you could be arrested. Economic ambition became unlawful. Public morality laws extended to gambling. Dice games were often banned outside specific holidays, and soldiers or labourers caught gambling excessively could face fines, because idleness was equated with disorder. In some towns, curfews applied specifically to women, restricting nighttime movement unless accompanied. Gender expectations were codified into ordinance. If you found yourself accused of debt, you could be detained until repayment. Medieval prisons were not designed for long-term reform. They were holding spaces to pressure settlement. Meanwhile, in parts of Scandinavia, failing to avenge a slain relative could diminish your family's honour under customary law. Justice was social obligation. In some German territories, duelling remained prohibited unless sanctioned. Yet, insulting someone publicly could legally compel formal challenge. Honour disputes hovered at the edge of legality. Market inspectors across England enforced strict measurement standards. False weights could lead to pillory punishment, locking offenders in wooden frames in public squares. The humiliation was part of the penalty. Even bread size was linked to grain prices through the assize of bread. and deviation, intentional or accidental, could trigger corporal punishment. Feeding your community incorrectly was treated as fraud. In plague-stricken years, quarantine measures were enforced with guarded gates. Breaking isolation not only endangered health, but invited legal action. Entire households could be sealed inside marked homes. In times of war, refusing to supply troops with food or shelter when required could result in confiscation. Civilian property rights were secondary to military necessity. Even language could entrap you. In England, speaking French during certain nationalist tensions or criticizing royal campaigns could be construed as disloyal. Slander laws protected nobles disproportionately. Insulting someone of high rank carried heavier consequences than insulting a commoner. Equality before law was not a principle. It was a fantasy. Throughout medieval Europe, tithes to the church were mandatory. Failure to pay could result in excommunication, which carried real-world consequences: exclusion from community, denial of sacraments, and sometimes refusal of burial in consecrated ground. Spiritual discipline had economic teeth. Refusing to attend mandatory musters for military training could result in fines, because every able-bodied man was part of the kingdom's defense system. And perhaps most unsettling of all was collective responsibility. If a murderer was not found, entire villages in England could be fined under systems inherited from Norman rule. If a thief escaped, your neighbours might demand compensation from you. Innocence was no shield against communal penalty. The medieval legal universe was suffocatingly comprehensive. It governed your wardrobe, your wages, your worship, your weapons, your windows, your work hours, your wedding feast, your mourning rituals, your travel routes, your reading materials, your livestock, your leisure games, your silence, and your speech. It punished ambition beyond station, curiosity beyond doctrine, mobility beyond permission, and individuality beyond conformity. Dropped into that world with your modern habits, questioning authority openly, dressing however you like, changing jobs freely, travelling spontaneously, expressing beliefs without fear, you would not last long before fines, accusations, or worse began to accumulate. Survival was not about bravery. It was about blending so perfectly into expectation that you became invisible to scrutiny. In a society where law sought to preserve hierarchy above all else, the strangest medieval rule was the unspoken one. Your life was not entirely your own, and every breath you took moved within boundaries drawn by crown, church, guild, and lord.